there are clearly many, many people in Washington who are making a very good living convincing their clients that they can influence the Congress to weaken the Clean Air Act and to preempt the rights of states to do the job the Clean Air Act requires them to do. They have now had 40 years to do that. In 1977, the amendments were not weakening. In 1990, with George Mitchell, also from Maine, at the helm, the Clean Air Act was strengthened, was actually strengthened. And the states continue to be aggressive on these policies. So, cottage industry of lobbyists, yes. Lots of money being spent, yes. If I were advising an industrial client, I'd say they might be better off spending their money on pollution control rather than on lobbyists, because pollution control is a more effective outcome.
Why did it succeed, the Clean Air Act, where something like cap and trade failed?
The political times are very different. The political environment is very different. As I said, we had closed sessions. We had members who trusted and respected each other and each other's views. We had members who thought that the purpose of government was to solve problems. So it was a very, very different environment. The fact that most of the basic decisions were made behind closed doors was a very important part of it, because members who might otherwise be exposed to constituencies with which they would be uncomfortable if they took an aggressive or progressive position were able to take that position and discuss it and come to a common conclusion. But they can't do that today. They don't have that opportunity. Cap and trade it never was drafted in the Senate by a group of senators with competing views and competing ideas, such that they could come to something they could deliver to their colleagues. It doesn't work. It works in the House. In the House, you simply have to have a majority. You don't have to have an agreement on policy. In the Senate, you have to have a supermajority, and thus you have to have an agreement on policy. So that agreement was never reached in the Senate. There was never the kind of consensus that would bring the people together to get. And besides that, it was a bad bill. I mean, it was a piece of legislation that didn't really respond to what the public would support in the way of a new regulatory statute. And it was very badly mischaracterized. Even the good parts of it were mischaracterized in the media.
The Clean Air Act might not be the best vehicle to attack carbon emissions?
It is certainly not the best vehicle to attack carbon emissions. It's probably a very good vehicle to attack methane emissions, which is a greenhouse gas, to attack black carbon, which is a greenhouse gas, and to attack certain kinds of fluorocarbons, which are greenhouse gases. But CO2, it may be more difficult simply because the technology to control CO2 may not be available at the levels of reduction that we'd like to see.
Could the law be used against itself so that environmental groups and others could tell the EPA, you have to regulate carbon at the lowest possible standard, which means potentially your backyard barbecue might have to get a permit?
Absolutely. Well, I don't know. The backyard barbecue thing is a convenient Fox News example. The fact is that EPA cannot promulgate a regulation on a source of pollution if it doesn't have a technology to control that source. The emission reduction must be based on best available control technology. So whether or not LISA has the authority under the Act to increase the amount of emissions to establish a base for regulation, I don't know. It stretches it in my imagination. But the real question is, are there technologies that will reduce emissions of carbon dioxide?
What do you expect to happen come January in the 112th Congress? How are things going to change?
One would wish they would change. My suspicion is that the House is going to pass some retrograde legislation and the Senate's going to ignore it. by and large. I mean, I think that the only way climate change legislation is going to see the light of day is if Obama's EPA is able to come up with a defensible regulatory process that forces Congress to act. Other than that, I would not expect any significant changes to be made. Now, that said, there is always the risk, and the Republicans are pretty noted for this, of using the appropriations process to put limitations on EPA. And if the House Appropriations Committee were to send over a bill to the appropriations bill to the Senate that handcuffed Jackson's authority to do anything on climate change, my gut tells me the Senate would go along with it, because I don't think the Senate is trustworthy on this. The question is whether or not there would be enough senators to filibuster that kind of move. But it's going to be that kind of game.
Congressman Waxman said to me yesterday that he worries that if the United States doesn't go ahead with some form of cap and trade legislation or carbon limitation legislation, that the U.S. will lose its lead in this type of technology, and we're going to have to go to places like China to get it. Do you see that happening?
Yep, Henry's absolutely right. I mean, we've seen it over the years that we are gifted in this country with having a very, very inventive public. The number of patents that are secured in the United States vastly outnumber the number of patents secured anyplace else. But very often, that technology flees our borders because we don't implement it. And Henry's absolutely right. If the United States doesn't stay in the lead, it will be far behind, and it'll move, because technology these days moves so quickly. There isn't any opportunity to lose that advantage. It's gone. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, a better example. I've got the figures in my head. We had 44 hearings, and we had equivalent number of Senate markups, and we had 45 conference committee meetings with the House. 120 days of actual direct member involvement, not just staff. Since 1974, 75, since the enactment of federal election law reform, since the change in campaign finance and the perception of campaign finance, members of Congress, either party, have not had time to legislate. They have been so busy having to raise money. I mean, the average member has to raise thousands of dollars every day for the 18 months before the next election starts. So they don't have time to go sit in committees, and they don't have time to go sit in markup sessions. They turn this over to staff. Staff meets, staff comes up with something, staff puts it out. Unfortunately, in most cases, staff is more partisan than the members are. And you don't get the same kind of interaction between staff that you get between members. So the net result is that you get a product that doesn't reflect any consensus building. And that's what kills it.
Is there any consensus then on the next step for environment, improving the environment?
Well, I'm not close enough to the actual process to tell you. I think that it'll take two things. One, it'll take a Democrat who is willing to reach across the aisle, and a Republican who's willing to reach back. And they're going to have to sit down, and then they're going to have to try to bring their colleagues with them. You saw what happened on health care. Max Baucus sat down with 5 other senators, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. They spent 3 months, and they couldn't come to an agreement because it wasn't politically palatable to come to an agreement. I think that's the problem today. I don't think that under the current climate, a consensus, an agreement is politically palatable.